Okay, good morning all. I could say happy spring, September the 1st. Welcome to members of the committee and to members of the public. We have a public forum this morning, which we'll come to in a moment. Welcome to our staff. And a special welcome to Te Pio Kawe as our tangata whenua representative here for the first time with voting rights. It's a great day, I think, for the council to begin on that journey. Just reminder, as we do every time, that we have our cell phones on silent, and if we're speaking, we speak into the microphones, bringing them as close as possible. You'll notice the microphone moves. You don't have to, so just drag it in when you are speaking, please. Are there any apologies? I think everybody is present. Oh, Steve is. Do we know, is he coming? As far as we know, we're assuming he's coming. We'll just put an apology for lateness. Someone like to move that? Thank you, Councillor Clout. Seconded, Councillor Kitty. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, that's carried. So we have a public forum this morning. Des Heki from the Kaitimakau Maori Land Trusts up there, and in relation to the Welcome Bay and Ohauiti study, which is item 1 on the agenda. So Des, if you'd like to come forward and take the seat next to Tina there, and we'll hear what you have to say. There will be 10 minutes. If there's time left, there'll be time for questions. And then you're, of course, and the gentlemen that are with you in support, welcome to stay for the first item is then on the Ohauiti and Welcome Bay study. So over to you. Kia ora. I'll hit the button when you're ready.
Morena, congratulations, Pio, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for your time this morning. My name is Desmond Heki Kaiwha. Our family homestead is located in Kaitimakau, and I'm accompanied here by 2 other trustees of a cluster of Māori land blocks in the southern city council boundary, and that's Kaitimakau J2, M1, M2 and N. And this particular land is all contiguous land. It's zoned rural. It's currently dairy runoff and a few homesteads. Also, the area is approximately 113 hectares when you combine the blocks together. Just by way of further background, in 2006, the same trust, Kaitimakau J2, M1, M2 and N, we're all part of a Te Puni Kōkiri land use study, and part of that process the trustees put together a submission with regards to the future development for that particular area. So along came 2017 with the Ohauiti Welcome Bay study, and during that communication there was an indication that Kaitimakau may feature in that study, and Kaitimakau lands was part of the Ohauiti, which is Ohauiti south of Boscobel, so Riddingtons, and then across to the blocks that I'm raising, all the way through to a couple of blocks at the end of Waikite Road, and then across to Ranginui Road.
Des, can I just quickly interject and say that for our members, that page
Yes.
16 on these big maps will really help us follow your blocks there,
Oh, okay.
just so we can get a good understanding.
Yes. So, after explaining that scope, we're looking at Area 2 now. Kaiti Mako, those are the blocks, and M2 is the block which is shaded in green. So that was land suitable for urban development. You had at the time the special housing accord through legislation developed what they now known as Three Creeks, Edler Drive, and Area 1 is the Riddington. So those were the two areas. And during the public, so if I can go back to just background and chronological order, during the study and the public consultation process, various landowners from also general title lands as well as other Māori land trusts and owners did attend. But in particular for the Kaiti Mako cluster, I would say certain information in particular around the assessments was requested and that was in order so that in 2019 the trust had again approached Te Puni Kōkiri with regards to developing its feasibility based on the water, traffic, stormwater, sewerage assessments that were being made available. Nothing really happened in 2019 in terms of that other than requests for information. Come along 2020, in July, at the public meeting, we kind of felt with a number of landowners that, oh, hang on, we've been left out of the picture again. And it really wasn't until after the meeting that we, a number of us looked at the council, this committee's report, agenda, minutes. I think we've seen the minutes, but definitely the agenda and the reports that were available. And we kind of realised, oh, we've missed out. So it kind of confirmed what we had heard at a consultation meeting about 2 nights after the committee had met. So I actually got hold of Bill, and Bill put me on to Tina. And then Tina and Heidi came out a couple of weekends ago, gave up their time to have a look at the greater area, across to Ohawiti, down to Ranginui, but we focused a lot around the Kaiti Mako area. So some of the constraints to this, as you may know through the reports, have been the development of infrastructure. As I've looked at the report, and we've only had this report released, I think, last Monday. So we haven't had time to actually digest it in full, though it seems like a lot of the alternatives that the landowners had put down and given weren't really taken into account or consideration. And I just want to go back onto some current examples why. Just further down, which is out of the study, you've got a Māori land block that was zoned for papakainga. It's in residential. There's no connection to sewage, so there's only 2 dwellings. Whereas on the other side of the road, you've got sewer connection, and you've got 500-600 sections available. And at the moment, you've got the Kaiti Mako water main going through the land blocks, and there's it's a reticulated system, so it's a backup if something on the main Welcome Bay line was to fault. then they can reticulate the system up through the hills. Well, the landowners don't actually have any access to that because we understand it's engineered as a water main. And so these were opportunities that the landowners and trusts could have seen to have like a rider main or junctions put in place for infrastructure that may allow the consideration of water supply for those blocks. Anyway, going further to some of the other current examples, if you go there, if you look across to the west, you see the Three Creeks Subdivision, which was the Adler's Special Housing Accord. Some of those sections, or a lot of them are terraced down to 300-400 squares, and this is just opposite the farm. So you've got like real, then you've got a lot of pressure that is placed on our old Ealing ground, which is where I learnt how to read the, amongst other places, the moon and the stars for Ealing and all the like. And we actually found part of an old eel weir there, part of an old village, and that old wetland was actually dug up and then a new diverted stream put in place. And now they're just considering what are the options for Culvert Bridge crossing. So, and we hear that through the studies, a lot of the encumbering factors to development for Kaitimuka Welcome Bay was pressure on these particular issues: archaeological, ecological, stream, river crossings. Yeah, and we just kind of find it hard when you're out there on the farm and you can just see it. It's just, occurring. So going forward, I thought with the time, a few seconds, engagement is really the key for the for any communication and any information to be assessed and ultimately decided upon by the various committees and delegated authorities through council and other councils. But in particular, the engagement framework that was approved last month looked at a model that I reckon it's really taking away the statutory obligations for council by putting it to just rangapu members, because these are landowners, Māori landowners, and hapu land got extinguished after the Battle of Gate Pa. Unless you know what I mean, that there is a representation there, but there's actually no mention of that in that 4 tier, even in tier 4, or even if you think about if there's a 5 or 6, there's no acknowledgement of the landowners. And as the quick examples, that's kind of what happened over in Te Tumu, where the understanding and mechanisms of Te Ture Whenua Māori, the Māori Land Act, the purpose of the Māori Land Act is to actually retain Māori land, and Māori land has its own instruments to do its development, and I think that's where a lot of the technical issues broke down. So that information is not coming through with staff, because probably there's no expertise in that particular field. And that's why there's this particular risk with not having this engagement. So going forward...
Yeah. So there are there is a question which I want to allow, so if you can just...
Yes. This for the committee's consideration was to look at a landowners group engagement with TCC, could be this committee, similar to a landowners ratepayers association, because it's more representative of the administration of the land trusts as well as the landowners. They may be hapu as well. Well, they probably are. They actually may be living overseas, but they all are part of a constituent of landowners in a particular given area. This could actually go for the other Ranginui blocks too, and also the other one going forward for consideration was to revisit the feasibility options of future urban development for at least the Kaitimuka land blocks. Kia ora, thank you.
Kia ora, Councillor Granger has a question.
Hey, thank you,
Time
Dennis,
for
and
one.
good to see you on board here. And I'm giving a little bit of history about that area too. And thanks to Tina for helping you on. Just a question through the chair to the staff, perhaps to Andy. Just coming back to the communication between the TCC and the landowners, in particular the Maori landowners. Can you give us a little bit more clarity on that, or perhaps clarity on some of the lack of communications that was had?
Oh, sorry, Janine Speedy.
So the purpose of the study was a technical assessment to understand infrastructure in terms of the three waters, transport, but also social infrastructure. And through the preparation of that study, so at the kick-off, once we had the resolution from council to progress that study, we held a hui. We had an individual, we had an iwi and hapu hui, and then we had a Māori Land Trust hui following that, and that was really the project set up to let the Land Trust be fully aware of the purpose of the study, what we were doing, and the methodology of how we were going to do it. So that would have been back in 2017. Then we had a follow-up hui with the Land Trust and iwi and hapu, and that was as we had finished the first two stages of the study, and that was to understand the potential for growth and what blocks had been identified and where we were at in terms of the technical. So it was kind of like an update on where we were at. And then in the last couple of months, or month or so, 6 weeks, we have had another hui with iwi and hapu and the Land Trust, and that was to give them an update of all the technical work that had been done, the key findings of that technical work. And also we had discussion around next steps, so what our resolutions would be, our recommendations would be going up to the UFTID committee to consider.
Okay, if it's okay with the chair, back through to Dennis. Does that answer some of your questions in regards to the communication, Dennis?
Yes, all right, Bob. Well, we're that's what I was saying. We had the expectation, and I was in communication on behalf of the trust with the planners to have this information. So we had Te Puni Kōkiri was facilitating the meeting of the landowners, so we could get our own independent advice. We had approached Veros, and so then we could have the feedback, because council were asking, what's your aspirations, where do you want to put here and there. So we actually answer that question, we needed some expert advice to come back, planner on planner, to talk to the council. But we never had that. Like 2019 just rolled by, we were meeting, but it was going to be like a 6-week exercise to do the assessments, but time just ran out. So we weren't able to make a response, and by the time we heard back, the goalposts had changed again, just like they did in 2018 something. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Des. You'll see in the recommendations, B3, commence engagement with Maori Land Trust in the study area. So it's something we will be exploring, and if you stay while we do this next item, I know members will want to explore it further with questions, but we'll conclude your public forum part here. But I think you can be assured we are wanting to move on and explore the opportunities with you and with the trusts to get housing going and stuff, and I think the staff are very committed to that as well. So thanks for coming in. No, he's not getting a question. No, so we'll conclude, no, we'll conclude that, we've allowed time. Because there is a time allocated for public forum, and we have extended that time, and you can ask questions when we get to the item which is coming up next. No, I'm not. Thank you, Des. Appreciate that. I would encourage you to show respect to the chair, Councillor Robson. I will repeat my question, my statement. I would encourage you to show respect to the chair. We will now move to the acceptance of any late items. Thanks, Des. Appreciate that. There are none. I don't believe, staff, we have any late items. Any confidential business to be transferred into the open? We have none today except the acceptance of the confidential minutes of the last meeting. So there won't be anything on that item. Any change to the order of business? We will, depending on how we go on the next item, we may have to change things around because the presenter, Cole O'Keefe from Waka Kotahi, is here at 11 o'clock, but we may have finished the first item by then, so that will work out, but if not, we will change that around. So we come to the confirmation of minutes. First of all, the minutes of the meeting 21st of July in the open section. Has anyone got any changes to those minutes they wish to bring? And you will have read the minutes from the confidential section. Are there any changes to those? If there are none, we won't need to go into confidential to pass those. So do I have a mover and seconder for that? Thank you, Mayor Temby. Seconded, Councillor Clout, for both sets of minutes. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, that's carried. We now move to item number 1. Oh, no, sorry, declarations of conflicts of interest. Are there any with the items today? Thank you. There are none. So, item 8, the business. The first is 8.1, the Welcome Bay and Ahawiti planning study. Steve, if you would like to come, and I imagine Janine and Andy will join you to present. Apologies for the lack of presenting space due to our COVID restrictions.
Good morning, Chair and Committee. So the item we have here to begin with is the conclusion of the Welcome Bay and Ahawiti planning study, which you understand, as discussed, has been underway for the best part of the last sort of 3 years. I'll just provide a brief overview and then hand over to Steve Tuck, who's led the completion of this report, to go through a more detailed presentation. I guess what I would say is some introductory remarks is that the study was driven by probably 2 factors. One is that in hindsight, I think we could all agree that this part of the city could have been planned better and is missing some probably key amenities and facilities. So we were looking at some of those items and how they potentially can be retrofitted back into this community. And then also there was a significant interest in further growth out in this part of the city. And that was coming through in previous years through special housing area proposals. There's also a significant amount of land that sits within the future urban limits in the smart growth strategy and the regional policy statement. And as you've heard today, some of that is Maori land. So there's significant interest in developing further out there. And so the purpose of this study was really to look at the feasibility of doing so, in terms of could we create a good community, could we overcome some of the existing issues, and in particular, what would it cost in terms of three waters and transport infrastructure, and how feasible would that be to deliver. I guess we take quite a broad perspective to this. We know that the city has significant growth pressures, so we're looking at this study from the perspective of taking an open mind to trying to unlock growth, not taking a closed mind to look to shut it down. But I think what we need to understand is there are some real challenges out here, and we'll get to that as we go through this presentation. So with that in mind, I'll just hand it over to Steve before I do most of the presentation before it even begins. So over to you, Steve. I should use my microphone.
Good morning all. I'm Steve Tuck, I'm a policy planner. For those of you who don't know me, I work underneath Janine Speedy and Andy Mead. I came on board with TCC about 10 months ago, and one of my jobs has been to help with winding up the Welcome Bay and Ohauiri planning study. So I'll kick off into the presentation now. My presentation is largely maps, and I'll just talk to them as we move through them. So I'll begin with just a quick overview of the current sort of state of play in the study area. Map number 1 here is just to outline in the red line the area that we actually considered in the planning study. So we have Welcome Bay on the east, and then Ohauiri on the west. As you can see from looking at the map, it's a very north-south oriented catchment, and most of the development that is within the study area feeds off north-south roads. There's not much in the way of east-west link road connections. Really, you're just relying, if you're in Welcome Bay, on coming down one of those north-south roads and joining onto Welcome Bay Road before you can come into the CBD via 15th Ave. Ohauiri over to the west has a little bit more accessibility, east-west, well, primarily to the west via Poiki Road, and if you were to travel south down Ohauiri Road, you could come around a long-winded route to Oropi Road from the south. So very quickly, the reasons for this study kicking off in 2017 was obviously population growth in the city and housing demand, central government requirements for council to look at where it could accommodate more growth, applications for special housing areas under special housing areas legislation, which has now been repealed. We had several applications for special housing areas in this study area, and there was a concern from council at the time that unleashing further urban growth in that area without really understanding what constraints exist probably wouldn't be the most prudent approach. So the study kicked off as a means to provide council with a high-level view of where growth potentially could be accommodated and areas that probably aren't feasible for growth at the current time. So with this presentation, we'll just run through a bit of a background of the methodology quickly that we took to the study, which, as I say, was a high-level study. We'll run through the technical assessments that were taken forwards for some certain patches of land that were considered to be feasible for more development, and then we'll run through the recommendations to after. So with the study area, it's primarily residential. This map 2, provides an overview of the zoning in the study area. The light grey is the suburban residential zone, so that's where the majority of the housing that you can see on this aerial map is contained, or the most dense, I should say, housing is contained. You can see obviously in the east and southeast, the sort of brown, orange shaded beige colour is rural zone land, so that's pastoral land, horticultural land. And in between there's a buffer of the rural residential zone, which is a darker shade of grey with some hatching. So the rural residential zone provides for housing, but provides for it at a much lower density than you would get in the suburban residential zone to the north. And in rural residential areas, some rural residential areas, depending on proximity to trunk lines, might be serviced with reticulated services and some might not be. The zoning map here also shows, running north to south, some of the gully systems that appear in the area, so they're highlighted with green. They're conservation zones and open space zones. Just as a guide, the bright green patch sort of in the centre at the north is Waipuna Park. These zone extents haven't really changed too much over time since they were introduced in the mid-90s. It was set up in this way in 1996 or thereabouts, when the first district plan came into being. Excuse me. It was reviewed. The zonings were reviewed in 2013 prior to the current district plan becoming operative. And at that time, an analysis of the constraints indicated that it was probably too constrained to warrant rezoning at that time, remembering this is 2013 with probably a different set of circumstances than what apply now in terms of the housing market. So the current district plan carried forward largely the zonings that have applied since 1996. Moving forwards to the current day and when the study commenced, as I said, we've seen more demand for housing capacity in the area. We've seen more demand from the community for commercial and retail services in the study area, particularly a supermarket. We know that there are some housing capacity shortfalls citywide, even with the plan changes that we're advancing at the moment with regards to intensification in central Tauranga, and as well as the capacity of the greenfield areas we have in Tauriko West and Te Tumu. And we're also aware of the fact that Welcome Bay Road is becoming even more congested, and as a main arterial servicing this area, that's a matter of some concern. So really the purpose of the planning study was, given these pressures, to understand what the latent housing capacity is in the area, both in the existing suburban residential zone, which is the light grey area, as well as what could be achieved with additional growth if we were to rezone areas of land in those rural residential and rural zones. We wanted to understand whether new housing would be able to contribute towards more infrastructure for the community and help with investment in local services and facilities. And we also wanted to understand what the infrastructure gaps are to not only servicing the additional areas in the rural and rural residential zones, if we were to allow growth there, but to also provide for the business as usual growth that we expect over the coming years in the existing suburban residential zone area. So I'll just move into briefly touch on the methodology that we worked through. The first step was to understand what is our housing capacity in a business as usual scenario, which is, just to be clear, what growth capacity do we have left in our existing urban zones? This map indicates some of the larger sites within the existing suburban residential zone that could accommodate growth. So this is not all of them, but this is just sort of the top 8 large sites that would accommodate some more substantial housing. We found that within the existing suburban residential zone, there's approximately capacity for another 1,300 dwellings. This table sums up those 8 larger sites in the previous slide in terms of their area and capacity. And it also gives some indication about what yields you might see from them and their current status. So just to run through this really quickly, we can see that, flicking back to the last slide as well, so just for reference, the pink dots are referenced here as 1 to 8. We can see that there's significant growth potential in some areas around Welcome Bay and Ohauiti in the existing suburban residential zone, including Māori land. We can see Kaitamako Road has some large areas of land that are currently undeveloped and potentially have some good capacity. There's also areas of general land which have good capacity as well. It's worth noting, given the study was commenced in 2017, the world has moved on a little bit, and we can see at number 7 there, Eagle Street has actually developed in the time since the study was initiated with the 26-lot subdivision. But further to this slide, if we want to quickly touch on a really quick overall snapshot of growth within the existing suburban residential zone, business as usual growth, it's summarised in this slide, which you'll have in map form there. We won't drill down into this in too much detail because it's difficult to read, but you can see the apportionment of growth throughout the suburban residential zone.
Through the chair, is staff happy to take questions along the way, or would you prefer to finish the presentation? It's a big presentation, that's what I'm conscious of, so.
Happy to do them along the way, are we?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have one, Councillor Rob?
Yeah, if we go back to the previous slide, no, the slide with the table on it, is that the sort of density we're sort of just looking at the yield in the area? It seems somewhat our BAU density, is that our expectation with BAU, the sort of density?
If I could just talk to that one, I think what you've got up there, say sites 2 and 3, which are two large sites which are under development at the moment. Site 3 is the special housing area down Adler Drive, and site 2 is probably two separate developments down McFettridge Lane. What that is the whole, that site area is the whole site area, so it includes all the constrained parts of those sites, the gullies, the escarpments, etc. So you can't do a quick calculation of dividing the area over the yield or the other way around to get the yield. The yields are higher than would be indicated by that.
Yeah, just I suppose a request for future, if we had total area and then developable area, that would be helpful in terms of just reading these tables, because it does beg a question. I mean, even with the Adler Drive issue, it's not exactly an inspirational level of density given what it is we're trying to achieve as a city. I just make that observation under BAU.
Yeah, correct. So with Adler Drive, that was set up as a special housing area, and the resolution was passed that it had to achieve 15 dwellings per hectare of net developable area. So it's just ticked that box, as I understand, just scraped over that 15 mark, which would mean average section sizes of around 450 to 500 square metres. Obviously some bigger ones and smaller ones. Correct, that's a minimum. Yeah, but obviously the topography out in this part of the city makes it harder to achieve higher densities than, say, the flatlands of Papamoa.
Mayor Temby?
Thank you, Chair. Andy and Steve, when you talk about, this is just one example, and it's an adjunct to Councillor Robson's question, as coincidence has it, but when you talk about Hollister Lane, for example, are you in the 2.1 hectares, are you talking about a proportion of the land to the west of Hollister Lane to try and get access to that rather large block? Is that what you mentioned there specifically?
The Hollister Lane site is the site on the corner of Hollister and Puiki Road. It's not the site at the end of Rosedale Drive, which is zoned residential but has no access or services. That particular site is not included up there because of those issues.
Sorry, those issues being the inaccessibility of it?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, even though it is zoned for residential development.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Councillor Hughes?
Yeah, I just have a question around infill housing like this and housing choice. In our new plan changes, we're trying to get housing choice for various different styles of housing. Is it quite a blunt instrument and we just have to rely on developers, or how can we achieve housing choice in the future with existing blocks?
So we're undertaking some work at the moment to feed into our greenfield plan changes for Te Tumu and Tarako West on that exact issue around density and housing typologies and housing choice to make sure we get a mix of housing going forward. So we would look to implement that through those particular plan changes, and then through the city plan review look at how that might more broadly apply across other residential zones in the city.
If there are no other questions, we'll move on. Steve, thanks.
As I was saying, this map basically just gives you an overview of the spread of housing yield potentially within the suburban residential zone. So moving outside of existing suburban residential zoned areas and into the rural residential and rural zone, we had to look at what was the potential capacity if we were to rezone land in those rural areas. This map illustrates an assessment that was undertaken to distinguish land that would be feasible for development at 15 dwellings per hectare, land which is marked as green, land that would be potentially feasible, which is marked as beige again, and land that, because of constraints such as existing development or site slope or any of a number of other constraints, flooding for example, or liquefaction, were deemed to be infeasible. Those are marked as red. So the assessment of the land in the rural zones and rural residential zones encompassed about 330 hectares. Of that, about 110 hectares was found to be infeasible, marked as red here. What was left over as feasible or potentially feasible was advanced to high-level infrastructure assessments to determine whether and how those blue-hatched, potentially feasible or feasible areas could be serviced. And just to help illustrate the distinction between land and general title and Māori title, we see here the overlay in blue of those feasible sub-precincts, with the yellow being land in Māori title. So as I mentioned before, Areas 2 and Areas 4 in particular, Area 6 to some extent contain large tracts of Māori land that were considered to be feasible or potentially feasible for development. So just to move into the population growth scenarios that we used to base the infrastructure assessments off, I'll just move back to this slide. We developed 3 population growth scenarios to test infrastructure capacity. So the first was business as usual, which was development within those existing suburban residential zones that we talked about just before. So within the existing established extent of urban residential zones, about 1,300 dwellings. Our moderate growth scenario picked up the land marked as green on this map. That would add approximately a total, in addition to the business as usual scenario, you would come out with a total of approximately 3,100 dwellings. So that scenario excluded multiply owned Māori land. So we had business as usual being what's left over in the existing zones that we could potentially develop. Scenario 2 for moderate growth being rezoning some land in the rural and rural residential areas, but not Māori land. Sure.
Can I
Councillor
just
Salisbury?
ask why we have only got multiple owned Māori land in the last option?
Yes. I'll come to that right now. Okay. Our third scenario, our high growth scenario, was rezoning and developing all of the blue hatched areas that you can see on the map there. So that would yield about 4,700 dwellings. So the reason for putting the multiply owned Māori land into the high growth scenario was probably largely in part due to the availability of bringing land to the market. So land in general title is typically more attractive to the market because dealings with general land are easier. You can't necessarily sell Māori land on the general real estate market. There's also a factor in terms of the multiply owned Māori land on the map here is owned by different parties, and not all of them will have the same aspirations for development. Some may want to develop to in line with our assumptions of 15 dwellings per hectare, but some may not want to do that. Some may want to do more and some may want to do less. So I guess there's a patchwork of uncertainty there that probably lends itself to consideration more in a long-term view than a short-term view.
I just wonder how our planning could be just a bit more equitable, I guess. Like, even though it's harder, doesn't necessarily mean it's not the right thing to try and do.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest, just because it's sitting in a different scenario, the assumption isn't that development of the Maori land would be a bad thing, would of course be a good thing. It's just to put these, to ensure we've got a range of scenarios that let us look at this issue in different ways. Yeah. So one of the options, as we know, is that a range of that Maori land might take longer to develop, or the aspirations might not be for an urban style of development. So we wanted to ensure that we considered that scenario, along with the scenario being the third scenario, which included the full urbanisation of the Maori land. So it was just to make sure we had a spread of options that were on the table as we considered infrastructure and costs.
Mayor Powell and then Councillor Hughes.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a question through you, Chair, to Poi, really. Andy, because I think, and I'm just directing it to the staff as well, but I'm just interested to get your view on this, because I think Tina makes a really good point, and I'm not sure if we're kind of acknowledging it properly, where what I'm hearing is the opportunity or potential opportunity for a co-investment partnership with iwi. And I just wonder, to Poi, where that would sit comfortably in this particular tract of land with Ngāti Ruahine. There's the hapu, right?
Yep. Can I respond? Yep. Kia ora. Yes, so the Ruahine are based at Waimapu. What we've got when we're looking at Kaitimaku is a mix between Ngāti Ahi and Ngāti He. so Maungatapu and Haidini. And then as you move out to the Ranginui blocks along Ranginui Road and up to Waikite, we then include our cousins further around the Tahuna o Rangataua in terms of Ngā Pōtiki. I have a similar issue, but I think the development of Māori land can actually be incorporated into all of the scenarios. Māori land development doesn't just reside in terms of scenario number 3. I premise that in terms of like if the issue that Des was raising in terms of those collective Māori land blocks, they sit in terms of just going back to one of the previous maps. 4, just in terms of identifying that the block that the representative block that Des was raising only has identified 13 lots on there. Am I reading that right? No, the map 4. Yep. And so it's the multiply owned Māori land block that Des and the 4 blocks that sit outside of the urban area in the rural, and it has a number 13 on it. And those related back to the earlier table. No, that one. Yeah, and so there's that, the Kaitimakau block that Des was representing has a number 13. What does that represent?
Yes. The answer to that is because this is looking at the business as usual scenario, so this is looking at current zonings. So that land being in a rural zone would have a lower yield under that zoning versus if you were to rezone it.
Yeah. And all I'm raising is that that's the issue that we've got. If we use the business as usual, you don't include multiply owned Māori land until you get to scenario 3, you're stuck with the provisions of dealing with, as you put it, well, I'll just paraphrase what you were saying, the easier land to develop is the general land. And it's easier because it's more accessible in terms of being sold on the open market. Māori land is not. And so I think Des and the others that were here was that there has to be parallel development between the multiply owned Māori land at the same time that we're dealing with development across. So, so at Hollister Lane, Fretridge, and Adler, those are being progressed because they're looking to sell those blocks. What we're looking at when we're talking around 4, 5, and 6, in terms of those blocks, which are already zoned within the residential zone, is the opportunity to access those. But I don't think they're going to achieve those densities on those particular blocks because the aspiration isn't for sale on the open market. What we're looking at when we're dealing with the multiply owned Māori land blocks is utilising the land to provide affordable housing options for the beneficiaries. So that takes them out of the homeless situations, overcrowding situations, gets them into affordable housing options to put them on to provide safe housing for their families. Otherwise, they won't be able to afford housing options that are currently open on the open market.
Chair, just a quick supplementary. It's really a comment. This is exactly the point I was trying to make, and I think this is what Tina was trying to get at. I think we tend to say, we look at Māori land, and then we say, we can't do anything with that. What I'm hearing is an opportunity to partner to do something that we are in desperate need of here in Tauranga Moana, which is the development of land for social housing.
Yeah, I think Andy wants to respond to that. Thank you.
Yeah, cool. There's probably a few points there. Firstly, as you can see on this table, in the business as usual scenario, there is development on Maori land included within blocks that are already zoned residential, and as we saw, some smaller amounts on rural residential or rural Maori land blocks. So that's probably the first point. In terms of the second point, you know, we are going to work through all these issues that have come up through today's presentation and discussions. What we're saying in terms of the recommendations in this report is that the options of retaining some development rights or additional development rights on the Maori land blocks in Welcome Bay is very much still on the table and something to be progressed through the city plan review. What we are saying is that full urbanisation at 15 dwellings per hectare is challenging because of infrastructure, but if we're talking about papakai and development, affordable housing for their own people, that's a completely different discussion, and one that we're very much open to. I just want to, for Mayor Powell's benefit, just point out what I think you were getting to, so I'm just going to use the pointer here. So I think in terms of Waimapu and that area around the marae out there and the multiple owned Maori land, that sits in this grey area here. It's outside the study area, and I believe you were sort of linking that to the site just at the end of Rosedale Drive here, which is currently doesn't have access and services. So that's a separate discussion that wasn't picked up in this study, but is something that could be perhaps progressed at a later point in time separately.
That's really good stuff, Andy. Can you just add to that, and then I'll come to Councillor Hughes for her question, and then Councillor Robson, I've seen yours. What would be the impact of us actually just rezoning it as residential, the multiple owned Maori blocks there? You know, what does that do? There are consequences of that. There are unintended consequences. Can you just elaborate on that?
Yeah, I'll let Janine jump in a second, but I'll just, I mean, the first thing is we need to work through Method 18 requirements of the regional policy statement to rezone land that's greater than 5 hectares in size. That requires full structure planning, consideration of infrastructure requirements and capacities. We would have a significant struggle to move through that process unless we were able to find solutions to the infrastructure constraints that we've identified through this study. What it would probably mean if we were to look to zone it is there would have to be significant staging provisions where development couldn't commence, reticulated development or development at any scale, until that reticulated infrastructure was in place, and in particular until transport solutions were delivered for this area. And I think we, you know, in terms of, it's probably, you know, it's a good point to discuss, but it's probably a point we could come back to once we have completed the presentation and you've got a fuller view of those other issues. Anything else, Janine?
Okay, Councillor Hughes, your question, and then Councillor Robson.
Yeah, it seems as though those kind of, that doesn't apply to the housing that we're currently letting happen on that land. So I'm wondering whether if we were to add the Māori land into the first scenario, whether there's whether one of the solutions might be to actually to change the zoning on some of the other land that's in the zoning already, so that you can balance up your...
Well, I think the key point from that previous slide, which Steve popped up here, is that a large chunk of the business as usual land that hasn't yet been developed is partway through the development process. So as you can see up on the slides, the two biggest development sites, number 2 and number 3, are fully consented and under development. As is, you know, site number 7, and there's a range of other smaller developments happening already out in Welcome Bay and Ohaueri. What you would also have is quite a significant process of a number of years to look to try and remove existing use rights in terms of rezoning land from residential back to other land uses, which would no doubt, at least in some instances, result in a response where people go and get that development capacity consented. And there's not much we could do to prevent that in that intervening period. The other thing is, as shown in this slide, a lot of the capacity that we have in the existing zoned parts of the study area is actually Maori land itself. So you'd be removing Maori land to replace it with alternative blocks of Maori land, which wouldn't probably achieve that purpose. So there are some constraints to that.
Thank you. Councillor Robson.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, Andy, it's a question about sort of process, and today my feeling is that this council, and in fact this community, needs to understand the opportunities stroke challenges that apply to the development of multiply owned Māori land, and that we need to actually workshop, briefing, to actually really get into that issue. I'm worried that today we're sort of mixing two issues. One is the planning study for Ohauiti Welcome Bay. I personally highly respected and very intelligent person to your left is nodding, and the development of multi-owned Māori land. And I wanted to question Mr. Hickey earlier because I noticed that he repeatedly referred to landowners, and the response he got back was trusts. And I know enough about development of Māori land to know that it's not always the owners' views don't always align with the view expressed by the trust, and trusts sometimes have challenges with regard to the owners not sharing their aspirations or owners having different aspirations. I do think there's a opportunity here. Would that be, do you see value in that, actually running a workshop specifically around this issue where people like Mr. Hickey and Pierre can come to us and we can have a proper conversation to really understand how you identify aspiration and how you deliver that aspiration within the current rules? Because I'm worried that we're going to mix the two here and achieve understanding of neither.
Just let Christine respond first and then...
Those types of conversations would probably be a really good topic for the Tangata Whenua committee, so that you've got a formal committee where you've got both Tangata Whenua and council around the table in terms and opportunity for them to, Tangata Whenua come and talk to you and share. They've done that, you've done that previously from memory, TPO, in terms of providing an overall picture of Māori land, the challenges and the opportunities, but that would be a good place for it to happen. And also through the LTP, Tangata Whenua have raised previously around development contributions on Māori land, and that's currently sitting in the schedule of topics to be addressed, and that will also come through. So it seems to be a more appropriate place to have those general workshop sharing of information where you've got all the people, but Pierre may have an alternative view.
If I can just respond quickly with regard to the staff response, Chair, the issue I've got with that committee is it's constituted with only half the councillors. I think every councillor needs to understand this issue.
In the past, when we've done that, we've invited all elected members to come to those meetings, so to make it really clear to all elected members what the topic is and encourage all elected members to attend.
Tapio, can you just also, Tapio, can you respond to, in what you were talking about earlier before the meeting, about the partnerships that are being developed with central government agencies and so on to address these issues? And then I'll come back to Andy for a response to it.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond back to...
Anything else you want to say?
Okay, couple. I just wanted to respond back to the appropriateness of going to the Tangata Whenua Standing Committee. I think obviously that's appropriate and having that discussion from here with that committee. The most appropriate forum that has been established and has been operating for the last 2 years is Araro Tangata. So Araro Tangata had a conference day last Wednesday held at the Waikato University and invites all Māori land trusts across the whole of the Western Bay. So we had 78 people present on the day, and various people streamed in live to follow the discussions of the day. And so all that I'm saying is that there is a forum established for Māori land trusts because this isn't a new issue. This isn't a new issue, and what we've been doing with Araro Tangata is trying to prepare them to feed into the Welcome Bay study, to feed into the discussions that are having at Hangaro, the discussions that are happening down at Waimapu around the marae and Papakainga around there, is that those are actually led, as Des was saying, by those Māori land trusts and owners. So the Tangata Whenua Forum, and that was one of Des's comments around taking the information to the rangapu, which is appropriate. I mean, that discussion and what's being done by council to those committee members to feed back, but it won't be hapu and iwi groups who lead the development of Māori Plain, Māori land. It will be led by people like Des and others who are representing those bodies, those collective bodies. And so, yeah, I'm saying, one, there is a forum that is, has been established, has been running, trying to bring this information together to support Māori land trusts to be involved in determining what their aspirations are. And so what occurred, if I can just take a step back in time, back to, so in 2009, the joint agency group, the Western Bay JAG Committee for Papakainga, produced, out of smart growth, the Papakainga Toolkit. Papakainga Toolkit then led to 2011, 12, 13, 15 and 17 Papakainga workshops. Papakainga workshops were the vehicle to empower Māori land trusts to develop structure plans so that they can come back to council, get the appropriate consents, then go to Te Puni Kōkiri, get funding for infrastructure, and then the provision of those beneficiaries in terms of those landowners and shareholders to build those houses on their whenua. And TCC, Western Bay, Regional Council have all supported the Te Kete Paraha, the Māori Housing Toolkit, workshops when they've been appropriate. So I'm saying that there has been some momentum in terms of trying to encourage Māori land trusts to self-determine their own aspirations around their whenua. But it falls short in terms of funding to run those workshops. So we've come back to, and then kind of leads into the issue that the chair was raising around, well, what are the opportunities now, today? And so the opportunities today are exactly what we did at Araro Tangata, which was to invite the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, invited HUD, invited Kāinga Ora, invited Te Puni Kōkiri, invited representatives from the ASB, ANZ, Westpac, to find a solution around how they can support capital investment into Māori Plain, Māori land. So Crown agencies have a revised all of agency type approach. It's called Maihi, which is Māori and Iwi housing initiatives. And I'm sure Council would have received some information around the Maihi policy, of which just last month HUD put out, or have put in place a new funding program called He Taupua. So He Taupua is a funding mechanism via HUD to support Maihi around providing capacity building, feasibility studies for any one of these Māori land blocks to do exactly the aspirations, assessment, and coming up with supporting structure plans. So, the discussions with council around what you've been doing in the past around development contributions, supporting the Papakainga workshops, the Takawainga unit attending those, planners attending those workshops, providing that advice, have all led to Tauranga City Council leading the way in terms of the number of houses that are being built on multi-plan Māori land during those times that the workshops were running. You know, the 75 homes that were being built here in Tauranga Mona have outstripped what was being done by kāinga whenua. And we've been saying that to council that we're in a good position to progress this development. So, you know, a collective approach to support Māori Land Trust, to address the issues around hangaro and that are a good opportunity as we sit today, because those agencies are prepping to put that funding forward.
Kia ora. That's a great report and reveals how much we need to catch up with what's going on, really. So I think it would be good if we ask the Chief Executive if we can have time for us to be brought up to speed as elected members with all the things that have been going on in the space in a workshop or a briefing. Andy?
I could just make a quick comment, and then perhaps we can move on with the rest of the presentation. We've probably still got 2/3 or 3/4 of it to go. But I think the other key action to remember coming out of UFD and moving into a fuller joint spatial plan for the Western Bay of Plenty, one of the key actions that was agreed by all the partners was the development of a range of iwi spatial planning layers and an iwi spatial plan per se, and a lot of that would be targeted around understanding what the aspirations are for the development and use of multiple owned Maori land. And so the work that Te Pio has discussed fits very nicely with that, and that's an action that will be picked up over the next sort of 3 to 6 months in advance from there.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll move on with the presentation, but we will see if we can schedule that and attend some of those things as well ourselves. I think Councillor Salisbury attended that one, so we can self-educate as well. Thanks, Steve. If you can carry on.
Thank you. This slide simply just shows the numbers that we use for the infrastructure modelling. So tenure aside, we can see that in the business as usual scenario, we add another 1,300 odd dwellings. With moderate growth, we would look to add a further 122 hectares, yielding a total with the business as usual growth of 3,000, just over 3,000 dwellings. And then with high growth, with the rezoning and development of all of those feasible sub-areas on the previous slides, you'd be looking in the order of 4,700 dwellings. So that's business as usual growth, plus another 230 hectares of rural residential land being rezoned. So these were the figures, these dwelling counts were the types of capacity that we looked to model through the infrastructure testing to ascertain whether infrastructure could cope, would need upgrades, or would need new infrastructure to be built. So I'll quickly run through the, sorry, sir. That's the minimum amount that the regional policy statement requires. It's not to say that you potentially couldn't yield more from some patches of land, but then conversely other patches of land are going to be constrained as well. I'll quickly move through the technical assessments. We looked at these items shown here, so 3 waters, connections and servicing, the feasibility of a new commercial centre or centres, the provision of schooling, provision of open spaces, parks, reserves and recreational facilities, and the transport network. Just noting that this was all done at a desktop level. This didn't involve detailed site walkovers or site-by-site assessments. So with the 3 waters modelling, we basically found, in short, that there are no significant constraints to providing capacity to accommodate further growth in any of the scenarios. There would need to be further investment in the moderate growth or high growth scenarios, particularly for wastewater. Water supply, wastewater supply for business as usual growth within the existing suburban residential zone is already funded and planned through the long-term plan, but you would need further investment to supply those services for the high growth scenarios.
Steve, can I just, on that water supply, just check, I mean, in regards to the Kaitimakau blocks, or the Area 2, which are not included in this, like you've used the word excluded, which sometimes may signal it's completely out of the picture, but it's just the BAU arrangements. We could supply water there in other ways, like using that resilience pipeline to fill a water tank on the top of the hill that would supply water to a development, just off, just theoretically. There are ways we could supply it there. We're not saying it can't be done.
Yeah, that point is explained by the second dot point under water supply. So yes, we could do it. It's just a matter of the cost and the planning, yes. The next slide just talks about stormwater management. So this is probably a more site-by-site type assessment that you would need to do in those feasible sub-areas, because they're all different, because they all feed into different waterways and catchments that ultimately lead to the harbour. How you would manage stored water would be a site-by-site type assessment, which was sort of beyond the scope of this high-level study. But in general principles are that you would probably need to provide some stormwater management on site that might reduce development yields. You would obviously have to deal with the consenting requirements, either from district or regional council in terms of discharges, earthworks. You'd obviously also need to be looking at things like the displacement of overland flow paths onto other land. So that sort of detail really would filter down to the site-by-site assessment. It could be done, but it would be, as I say, a really detailed assessment of each site on its merits. We also looked at, a commercial assessment to determine whether there was any land available that could feasibly be provided for commercial centre development. So we looked at a couple of scenarios for commercial centre development, whether it be providing larger commercial centres, maybe a 10,000 square metre gross floor area commercial centre with a supermarket contained in it, or perhaps looking at a scenario of some smaller centres pepper potted around the study area. This map just shows part of a consultant's report that indicates in green the parts of the study area that contain flatter lands and that are within proximity to some of the main roads, so therefore would get some good traffic flow past and support the economic viability of a centre. So these, I suppose, would be sort of broadly classified as the more desirable areas for a developer to set up a commercial centre in. What our commercial assessment found was that there's already enough demand from the existing residents in the study area to support a supermarket or a commercial centre. The real trick is finding a site that is large enough, that has the right topography and is that located in the right area for a developer and, I suppose, a landowner to negotiate and take the plunge. Our study found 12 sites that they long listed to assess, but on further assessment that was easily trimmed down to 4 sites that potentially could accommodate a larger commercial centre. But those sites are a mix of zonings. Those sites all have different landowners, obviously, with different aspirations. Council's also considered the use of its own land, such as parks or reserves, potentially for a retail or commercial development. But that would obviously raise some difficulties with, if we lose open space, then we're going to have to provide it somewhere else in the network, so it's swings and roundabouts, unfortunately. And community opinion obviously was canvassed as well in terms of the use of parks and reserves, and it certainly wasn't overwhelmingly in favour. So really where we stand now with regards to commercial centre development is that there is sufficient demand for that, but it's something that to a large extent relies on the private market to accommodate. However, we can look at it through the forthcoming city plan review to look at whether there's any moves we can make in a planning sense to better facilitate commercial development in the study area.
Just to I guess confirm what that means. So we will be talking to a small handful of landowners as part of the introductory work to the city plan review, and talking to them about whether they might be interested in their sites being rezoned for a commercial centre, moving through the city plan review project. But obviously those sites remain commercially sensitive, so we can't talk the detail of those in this meeting.
We worked with the Ministry of Education to look at schooling in the study area. I've highlighted on this slide where the existing primary schools are. There are no secondary schools in the study area. Ministry of Education is keen to develop a 4th primary school in Ohauiti. However, they aren't in favour of developing a secondary school in the study area. For a couple of reasons. One being that there's limited site availability to accommodate a secondary school, but also that they're planning upgrades and more capacity in their wider schooling network. So they have some concerns about potentially, for example, if a secondary school was established in the study area, that might draw students away from other existing secondary schools and thereby reduce the viability of those schools. But at this stage, they've confirmed that they are looking at building new secondary schools in Pies Pa, Tauriko, and that would free up some capacity in the existing network, and that would mean that the growth in student numbers within the study area could then be accommodated in those existing schools, Tauranga boys and girls. We have two recommendations.
Can I ask a question? Through the chair? Sorry, just a question around the schools. If Hawiti is chosen, is that an opportunity then for Welcome Bay to have a connection out to that school instead of having to come into town for their school?
So the Ohawiti school that the Ministry of Education are looking at is a primary school, potentially up to year 8, but it's not a secondary school.
We provided two recommendations on the schooling matters. One is to continue working with the MOE in terms of primary schooling provision around Ohawiti, and the second is to continue to work with MOE in terms of advocating for secondary schooling provision in the study area if it's possible. But we know that they're not planning that. Their correspondence was to the effect that they wouldn't plan for that unless the high growth scenario was to eventuate.
Did they specifically say they wouldn't do an intermediate, or was it just a high school? Are they open to the concept of an intermediate?
So, as I understand, one of their schools at the moment is a year 1 to 8 school, so it's picking up those years 7 to 8 intermediate kids. And that's a consideration in terms of the development of the new school they're putting in, or looking to propose in Ohawiti, whether that would go to year 1 to 6 or also up to year 8 as well.
I just wanted to comment on the existing school that goes up to year 8. It's a Steiner school, so it's a very different model of schooling. So really, it's not a, people don't choose, it's kind of not apples for apples.
Yeah. So we've also considered, obviously, the provision of parks and open spaces in the network. This slide, at a high level, illustrates the existing developed residential areas and their network of parks and open spaces, but you can also see in the hatching those feasible sub-precincts and their proximity as relative to areas where there are parks and open spaces. So we can see that if more growth was to come online, we would need to provide more parks and sports fields, and that land would need to be found, and it would obviously need to be suitable land. We know that for the business as usual growth that we have happening currently in our suburban residential zones, we would need another 1.5 sports fields, and we can provide that. In the moderate and high growth scenarios, we'll need between 3 and 5 more sports fields. Finding sites for those might prove challenging, but that's probably a matter depending on what land is opened up to where and what the constraints are in that particular area. Moving on to the transport network now. There were 2 steps to the transport assessment. So there was a high-level pass to begin with, just to do some modelling of 3 different options for east-west link roads. We modelled a bypass to the north, shown by the northern yellow arrow on that map, which was to get around the most congested part of Welcome Bay Road. We also modelled the performance of a central east-west link, generally between Welcome Bay and Ohawiti via Poiki Road, and then that southern yellow arrow indicatively shows a ring road to the south, which connects from Kaitamako around through Rosedale Drive and then onto Oropi Road. That modelling that we did as the first step was to ascertain which of these options is going to perform best in terms of providing additional road capacity and relieving congestion. It was found that the central option was the best performing option. That option was taken forward for detailed assessment. We'll move on to these next 2 slides, and these 2 slides just provide a comparison of the performance of that central option if we were to bring on high growth versus if we were to bring on high growth but not provide road capacity. So this slide shows the level of service that's achieved on the road network as it is today, but in 2063 with all of the additional growth included. We can see that Welcome Bay Road has patches of red, particularly out to the east. We can see State Highway 29 has patches of red, and that's indicative of a low level of service being provided. The three roundabouts that you can see in the centre of the picture, that are marked as black, are really performing very poorly indeed. So this is basically the model traffic congestion outcome for 2063 with high growth. This diagram shows the performance of the road network if we put an east-west link corridor in through the centre of the study area. So I've shown basically the alignment with those red arrows, and we can see that it does relieve to a degree some of the congestion on Welcome Bay Road, but it opens up more congestion on Poiki Road. Nothing changes with regards to the roundabouts around Harini Underpass. They're still congested. Nothing changes with regards to State Highway 29. It's still very congested. So this was the best performing modelled option, but by no means did it solve all of the congestion issues that we're facing around Welcome Bay Road.
If I could just make just a comment more generally about transport. One of the issues is that if we put more growth into Welcome Bay, we still more or less end up with a dormitory commuter suburb, because we're not going to be able to add large areas of employment in there. And, you know, to some extent we'll be able to add community services, but we won't get everything. We won't get a high school, for instance, it seems. So there still will be a high degree of people relying on travelling outside of that broader study area to work and to school, and which is, I guess, creating, those transport challenges on the network. And probably working a little bit against the live, work, learn, play philosophy that we're trying to achieve through smart growth and through UFD. So there's a broader question, I guess, for ourselves to ask around, even if we could put more growth in this area, how much more growth is the right level of growth?
This was the options assessment of the central corridor that we took forward for further assessment. So we looked at two options either side of Poiki Road to just get a high-level costing and to understand some of the constraints that we'd face in terms of progressing a project of this nature. So moving from east to west, we modelled two options from Welcome Bay connecting through Waipuna Park and then onto Poiki Road. One leading off Victory Street, one leading off Meander Drive, crossing Johnston Reserve, crossing Kaitamako Road, crossing some parcels of multiply owned Māori land, linking to Poiki, and then out to the west there we can see two options, W1 and W2. So W1 to the north branches off Poiki Road to cross the river and run through Greerton Park. The second option to the south is the widening and enhancement of State Highway 29A. That slide just provides an overview of the options that we considered. All of them run into a number of hurdles from a planning approvals point of view, from an ecological point of view, from an archaeological point of view. They all run through public land, private lands, multiply owned Māori land. So regardless of which option you were to choose, there's a lot of similar issues that you would face in terms of achieving approvals for these corridors. The two to the east were costed at essentially the same. Their estimated cost was 85 million. The southern option performed a little bit better in terms of planning constraints and hurdles. The northern option sort of intersects a range of archaeological sites and some more significant patches of ecology. The central option was costed at 14.7 million. The constraints there are really around managing the intersections, putting in appropriate provision for public transport, and some land acquisition potentially as well. And the western options vary significantly in price. The northern option being costed at around 31 million. The southern option through the state highway being costed in the range of 120 million.
Steve, just to clarify, this is looking at it from a increasing housing supply, but there has been a long question about whether there shouldn't be another access out of Welcome Bay just because it's a dormitory suburb for resilience and so on. So these things may still fold into the TSP work and come up with recommendations in the 30-year scenario. Is that correct? So this is not a sort of definitive, we're not doing that at any point, it's just, this is in relation to housing supply.
Yeah, that's correct. Thank you.
Councillor Avery?
Yeah, I have a few related questions, if with the grace of the chair. So with the costing of the transport options, who carried that out? And did we look at the high-level costings of options 1 and 3, or just those central corridor?
So I'll answer your second question first. So the central corridor was the one that performed best in terms of relieving traffic congestion. So that was the one that was advanced for more detailed study. And your first question, sorry, what was your first question?
Who carried out the work?
Oh, Oricon, yep. So this slide shows the cost estimates that they came up with for each section. So as you can see, particularly the last two, W1 and W2, there's a significant cost differential there.
Sorry.
Oh,
So because it seems like we're balancing off traffic congestion with housing, so for options 1 and 3, do you expect there'd be a significant difference in costs, or would they be similar?
Option 3, which is the southern option, would be as challenging, if not more challenging, than option 2 in terms of topography and some of the challenges there, in terms of differences in levels, stream crossings, and the extent of the gullies and the likes. I expect that would be of a similar nature of cost, if not more expensive, but that's just a view I have. It would certainly not be cheap, let's put it that way. The northern option is obviously a lot lesser in scale, and for that reason it certainly would be cheaper. How much benefit that would provide to the network would be a question I would have to pass over to either Peter or Bruce, who I've seen in the room, if you want that question to be answered. But I guess in terms of the northern option, it's not as if there is a corridor that's sitting there waiting for a road to be built on. There'd be significant acquisition of private land, including, as I believe, Maori land for that to be enabled, and that connection there really connects back on up to the intersection there where the Palmer's Garden Centre is, onto the State Highway. So there's obviously challenges, as you've seen in the traffic modelling slides, with the performance of that intersection, particularly in the future.
Did you get a peer review of that costing? It seems quite conservative.
I don't believe, no, it hasn't been peer reviewed. My thoughts would tend to agree with yours, that if anything, those costs probably are at the low end of what we could expect to deliver those projects.
Councillor Clout.
Thank you. Just on the western section, you've got 2 interchanges there. Are they grade separated interchanges, which would account for the, why it's a much higher cost than the W1? Is that correct?
I believe they were, yeah. Yeah, Peter, would you mind coming up and speaking to that?
All right, and Councillor Hughes had a question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you've done a cost per household based on the 3 scenarios of extra costs. So business as usual, the services will need for those, what that cost per 1,400 houses as the medium and long. It just makes it quite easy for us to kind of think about what delivery of housing is costing us over those 3.
Yeah, so I think the assumption we've been working on is that with the 1,300 homes that are zoned still already, they can be built with the infrastructure that is planned already, even though from a transport perspective that is going to create more pressure on the network. So the costs per house there, assuming we're not resolving those transport issues any further, are what the development contributions are, so roughly in that range of around $10,000 per house. Once you get up to the higher growth scenarios, or any scenario where it involves sort of delivering this new alternative link, you're getting up to around $60,000 per house just for the transport. On top of that is the other infrastructure costs that would be required. So it would be getting up into the range of somewhere between around $75,000 and $100,000 per home, roughly.
Thank you. So you say, so just to reiterate, sorry, through the chair, can I ask one more? Just so the business as usual, we add 1,400 odd homes, and we don't change the transport for them, and the modelling for that looks like, I mean, that's what, 3,000 more people? How many people per house also does that?
You're roughly right, around 3,000 more people. So you've got roughly one transport movement in the peak hour per dwelling. So yeah, roughly 1,300 more movements during that sort of peak period in the morning and the evening.
And no change to infrastructure for transport?
The infrastructure, the assumption is that through the study, no, but obviously we're running the Transport System Plan project. One of the key study areas for that is the 15th Ave Turret Road area and extending into Welcome Bay Road. And I think we all realise that something needs to happen to that part of the network in the future, but that's obviously a broader question beyond just the growth in Welcome Bay. That's a broader part of the wider transport network. So there would be improvements there that are assumed probably at the latter end of the next 10-year period.
Thanks.
Councillor Robson, then Councillor Arbery, but please, we do
following
need to
on
move on.
the line opened up by Councillor Heidi Hughes, one of the things that Nick Johansson's been very keen for us to do is obviously not just look at costs, but also benefits. So I suppose my question is, if that 60,000 per household transport scenario, does the benefit side of that, does that flow just to the additional housing, or is there any positive impact on the level of service experienced by the people already there? Or in fact, we need that additional transport just to provide a worse level of service for transport? Because if it provides benefit for all the houses already there at some level, then obviously the allocation of cost just to the new houses would be unreasonable.
Yeah, correct. So I think you saw in the full build-out scenario that the network wasn't performing particularly much better. So the benefit in the long term to the existing community might be quite limited. Obviously, in the intervening period, if you were, say, to build the road ahead of all the growth coming, there would be improvements in the network.
Okay, last question on this section, Councillor Arbery.
Yeah, I'm just trying to wrap my head around it all. So it seems on the one side of the equation you've got the 15 dwellings per hectare, which we can assume that's about right. Then on the other side there's the transport costs, which you're saying is a deal breaker. I'm just trying to think back. We delivered 4-lane expressway with interchanges in the highest bridge in the North Island, across streams next to Urupā, towards the lower end of that cost range. So I'm just wondering whether it's not worth getting some costings on the other transport options, because maybe some congestion would be acceptable. So I'm just wondering, what would the transport costs have to be to make the DCs viable economically?
In the some of the newer greenfield parts of our city, the development contributions are now sort of getting up in the range of sort of $30,000 to $50,000 per lot. I would say that in this area of the city, the values might not be able to withstand quite that level. Maybe the lower end of that, but you know, to be, if you're talking about to be competitive across the rest of the city in terms of what else we're charging across the city, probably in that sort of range. I think one of the broader points to note, though, is that as a council, we've only got so much money to play with, and we have to choose our priorities of where we invest in terms of intensification and our other greenfield options. And I guess from an infrastructure cost perspective, what we know is it's going to be much more competitive to invest in Te Tumu or in Tauriko West on a per household basis than it will be if we need to invest in infrastructure such as what is on the screen to service Welcome Bay. I think the other thing is in Welcome Bay you would expect the growth to happen over a much longer period of time because you don't have those large necessary contiguous land blocks so much where there's a real desire for a developer to get in and get out and move quickly through that development to provide housing supply. So there's a range of broader factors to consider.
Just one of the other points too is that you're more likely to have significant cost escalation risk in this type of terrain and area than you would in like Te Tumu, which is obviously flat and much easier to get more accuracy and have less unknowns than you would in this location.
Okay, thank you. If we can, how much further we are
Yeah, we've got
along?
6 more slides.
Okay, great, thank you.
One other consideration in terms of where we've landed in terms of our recommendations for the location of some additional growth versus perhaps leaving off growth for the time being is the resilience issues associated with Welcome Bay Road. The road's low-lying, it's subject to landslip, flooding, sea level rise, and it's also a main corridor for utilities servicing Welcome Bay. So if Welcome Bay Road were to function as the conduit for more transport movement and more reliance on the infrastructure that lies within that corridor, we probably would need to look at how we improve the resilience of that corridor to make sure that there aren't more members of the community being disrupted in the case of a natural hazard event. So we do have some initial planning underway for that, and it's being considered through the forthcoming long-term plan. But for the time being, Welcome Bay Road remains a corridor that's sort of at risk. Long-term, we may need to come back to this again just to consider alternative access routes if sea level rise means that parts of Welcome Bay Road become untenable.
Cloud, thank you. So are you saying, in summary, that it could be better for us to not invest hugely in Welcome Bay Road because of long-term resilience issues, and if we were then going to invest, we'd be better to invest in that central corridor as an additional corridor rather than effectively wasting money on Welcome Bay Road? Just a question.
I think there's a range of timeframes at play here. So Welcome Bay Road, particularly some of the low-lying parts of it, which are further to the east of Kaitimako Road, are subject to multiple natural hazard risks, particularly some of the water-based hazard risks from associated with sea level rise, if that eventuates. Now that will be a process over a number of decades or centuries. So it's not so much a question of not continuing to invest in Welcome Bay Road as it is at the moment, or not making investments to improve the resilience that, over the next sort of 20 or 30 years. What we're talking about is in 50 or 100 years' time, there might need to be another question put to whether, Welcome Bay Road remains tenable if some of those scenarios, like 1.2 to 1.6 metres of sea level rise, actually come to pass. And there's a significant amount of uncertainty around whether that would happen and in what sort of time frame. So I think continuing to invest in Welcome Bay Road now is the right thing to do because it's such an important connection for that Welcome Bay community.
Mayor Temby?
Thanks, Chair. Andy, and Steve, unless I've missed something obvious, and I hope I haven't, all those options end up back on Welcome Bay Road at some point as part of a link to, even if we talk of the Loop Road, I mean, the blue, the green, or in this case, the north and the south options will end up back there via, I can't quite read, is it Somebody, yeah, exactly. Bill, thank you.
Yeah, so this provides, I guess, a more of an interconnected network where there's another east-west connection out of Welcome Bay without actually having to use Welcome Bay Road.
I do understand that,
Yeah.
but at some stage it will end up back on Welcome Bay Road, right? It'll circle round to the east of that main
Yes.
tract and end up on Welcome Bay Road. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just think we need to truly understand that we talk about. I mean, Welcome Bay Road from a motoring point of view and as a cyclist, which I've said before, I will never use again, is a road that I would consider to be in disrepair in some parts. I mean, the sidings are broken. It's the main north-south arterial for the Welcome Bay population to get in and out of a dormitory suburb. And yet we're talking, so I'm pleased to hear that you say that the remediation and works will continue on it. I think that's very important. But I think it's really important we understand that all those north-south options, those projected lats, will end up back on Welcome Bay Road at some point. And the eastern side of Welcome Bay. That's
I think
right.
the way we were looking at it was to say that if you lived in Welcome Bay and you wanted to commute outward in the morning or back in the afternoon or the evening, that you could use a route that didn't involve Welcome Bay Road. Yeah.
Just a couple more slides. So this next discussion is just about the Upper Ohawiti growth area and feeds into our recommendations about potentially advancing that for some more consideration for growth. So this image is taken from the regional policy statement, and it just indicatively outlines the full extent of the Upper Ohawiti growth area. It straddles land in Tauranga City as well as land to the south of our boundary in Western Bay. And to the east, there's the Kaitamako growth area, obviously shown in green and grey hatching there. We zoom in on the next slide to the part of the Upper Ohawiti growth area that's within Tauranga's boundaries. So I hope I can make that distinction. You can see where it is on your maps to hand or on the screen. This was Area 1 in our feasibility modelling, which we indicated as being feasible for growth, basically in the short term. It's a patch of land that's about 66 hectares in area. It's owned by a trust made up of four people. It's general land. Part of it has already been developed with the Adler Drive special housing area, and there's about 55 hectares left that are still vacant. The location of this land vis-a-vis the other sub-precincts that we marked as feasible further to the east around Welcome Bay is probably an important factor in the rationale for our recommendations about taking forward some more investigations for this area. Being based on either side of Ohawiti Road, to the north, Ohawiti Road links in to the roundabouts of Welcome Bay Road and State Highway 29A at the Harini Underpass. You can get in a westerly direction via Poiki Road. If you drive north along Ohawiti Road, you can get out to the State Highway 29A via Poiki Road. And if you needed to take the long way around, you could head south and through a few country roads, you could link back up onto Oropi Road and come up north to the State Highway. So this patch of land is less constrained by the reliance on Welcome Bay Road than those other feasible sub-precincts that are further east in the catchment dotted around Welcome Bay. If housing wasn't enabled here, I guess there would be potentially a better traffic outcome because of those additional links that those other feasible sub-precincts just don't have. There's also the benefits, obviously, of the fact that it's general land owned by trustees that I understand council has had discussions with before, and it's already within a nominated growth area. Just to illustrate the point, going to this next slide, you can see in the bottom left-hand corner the part of that Upper Ohawiti growth area in the pink hatching, and then the Kaitamako growth area shown on the inset. So that Kaitamako growth area is, again, unfortunately, its access is only really via Kaitamako Road. It doesn't have the benefit of those other links that the Upper Ohawiti growth area has. So that's probably just illustrates the distinction between Upper Ohawiti and those other feasible sub-precincts in terms of the important kind of factor that geographic location has in terms of its reliance on the transport network. So, taking that on board, moving to quickly run through the recommendations now. The first two lead straight into what we've just discussed about Upper Ohawiti and the constraints for the other feasible sub-precincts in Welcome Bay. So the recommendation was not to proceed with structure planning for additional urban development in the Welcome Bay area because of the transport constraints and costs, various other constraints that we've talked about through the presentation too. The next recommendation just refers to the Upper Ohauti growth area specifically as a discrete parcel, and recommends that we discuss with those landowners their views about preliminary structure planning of that Upper Ohauti growth area. Subject to discussions with the landowners and subject to all of the technical assessments that you'd expect leading up into a structure planning exercise, that area could potentially form a small growth area to be advanced through the city plan review. Point 3 is important because we've seen throughout the conversations today that there's lots of Māori land in the study area that potentially could be used for development. So we see that a vehicle for advancing those discussions, in addition to what we've already talked about, is the city plan review as well. Going back to the transport issues with Welcome Bay Road, so yeah, I think the point here is that it's not a case of just saying, okay, well, Welcome Bay Road's in trouble, let's just leave it at that. It's more a case of understanding that it is a constrained corridor, but we still have some work to do in terms of understanding what the nature of any improvements we might be able to make to improve transport choice and connectivity around that area through the transport system plan. I discussed briefly earlier the fact that there are some constraints around supplying commercial land in the area, but again, that probably is an exercise that falls to the city plan review in some respects in terms of the rezoning of land, but that also is a matter that lies with landowners in the private market. Talked before about education. There are 2 recommendations here and on the next slide about working with the MOE on its primary school planning and potentially advocating with them to look at secondary schooling in the study area. That would obviously help with the transport issues that we see today. We know that there is a need for some more sports fields in Ohauti just to cope with business as usual growth. So we'd need to look at those through the long-term planning process. And similarly, another community facility is the Welcome Bay Community Hall and Centre. The current long-term plan looks at that being upgraded or redeveloped or improved around 2030, and that will go forward into future planning processes as well.
So if I could just make just one brief comment in terms of the recommendation around Upper Ohauti. What we're suggesting here is not moving straight into structure planning and rezoning. What we're suggesting is that we move into some preliminary and slightly more detailed investigations, particularly which would involve transport, to make sure we could, if development occurred there, acceptable transport outcomes could be achieved, as well as some further discussions with landowners to see if they are on board with this, just to check that, and if they're willing to be actively involved in really advancing and partnering in terms of that process. So that would involve some further work and then reporting back for some further decision making and direction from this committee. In terms of the Maori Trust land, particularly up Kaitimako Road, but also in other locations, I guess the suggestion coming through this study is that urban development is not likely to be feasible unless we do invest in that transport and other infrastructure. The other land uses we would be considering are more along the lines of papakainga development, rural residential development, horticultural use, and things of that sort of nature, not full reticulated urban development of 400 or 500 square metre sections across those entire Maryland blocks.
Right, Councillor Robson and Councillor Hughes.
Have it moved, Chair.
We probably need to explore questions about the resolutions, and then we can come back to you. And we may have to adjourn before we do in order to accommodate our external presenter with the next item. So, Councillor Clout, these will be questions around the resolutions.
Question. This is not specifically around the resolution, but going through some of those appendices. I noticed on page 56, this is of the appendices within our agendas, and it talked about that Welcome Bay, which surprising to me, had a larger proportion of employment within the area than the average residential area, and that surprised me. So it says there that there's 15% of the population are employees compared to 12%, which is the usual ratio around residential areas. So that was a surprise to me. Was that a surprise to you? And if so, does that have any impact on, because we always viewed Welcome Bay and Ohauiti as sort of dormitory suburbs? That's within the Becker report.
Perhaps that question could be given back to you.
Come back to us if you don't mind.
At a later
I
time.
know it's quite sort of specific and technical, but it just jumped out at me. Thanks.
You can come back with an answer, but I don't think it will affect the recommendations that we'll put forward.
Councillor Hughes?
I just have a few more questions around the Ohauiti Adler Drive area. So how many houses are in Adler Drive, or potential houses that are set to go?
So the Adler Drive Special Housing Area has 185 houses that are already consented. This additional area of Ohauiti South, I guess it's still to be determined and looking at constraints and managing stormwater and things like that, but I think the initial suggestions were probably in that 500 to 600 range.
So 500 to 600. So is there currently plans for a dairy or anything? So what I'm worried about is that we're still creating these suburbs bit by bit that don't create good communities. And how then can we be sure that when we're releasing new land like this, that we're actually really ready to change the way developers are thinking about housing and building for community, and not just subdivisions that end up not having the kind of facilities that our future communities that we know now our future communities want?
So that will be part of the structure planning exercise to look at the variety of land uses that would need to be considered. But beyond that, in terms of the broader Ohauiti area, certainly looking at what we can do around a commercial centre through the city plan review and looking to zone an appropriate site for that, which would provide for the broader Ohauiti community. And of course, we've discussed the primary school already. So really conscious that we need to get those other amenities and facilities into this area to make it successful.
Sorry, just one more. I know that we look at the general area, but when you've got 500-600, these are local communities, and I'd like to see how do we plan these? How can we make sure that these new communities do that? Because that answer didn't really help make me feel any more confident that this community is going to be any different to what we've already got.
So with that, like if you take the community centres example, so for all of our structure planning, we get detailed specialist reports on commercial centre needs, and looking at the location, the scale of those centres, how many centres are required. So this is what we've done for Tauriko West and Tutumu, and that's exactly the same process that we'd look to work through if we were to progress this area forwards.
We are going to bring a presentation to you on how we plan greenfield areas in general, what sort of factors are taken into account, the research and analysis and principles that apply, and we're talking about doing that, I think, November. So that will hopefully help in understanding how these areas are planned.
Okay, a final question to Pio Kawe.
Yeah, I was just going to seek some clarification from the team around what you were meaning by Papakainga development as opposed to leading into full residential development. What does it actually mean?
So through the preparation of the study and the hui we've had, and also general conversations I've had with tangata whenua who are part of land trusts or shareholders, generally is we have a need and we want housing to be enabled on our land. But the next, I suppose, step in that conversation is to understand what that housing looks like. And when in a lot of those discussions we've had is that some of them want to retain their avocado orchards or their kiwi fruit because that is still providing a really good income, but they also want to provide for housing, and that may be a cluster of 20 papakāinga housing on the site, so having multiple uses. So what we'd like to do through the city plan review is to really explore and fully understand what those aspirations are for those landowners, and how we can enable that through the city plan review. And what we're trying to say is that in many cases that's not a straight, we wouldn't look to maybe rezone it suburban residential. It may be a bespoke zoning that provides for that land trust. So the national planning standards provide us the opportunity to have multi-purpose zones, and in that way we can have bespoke responses, as we do in the plan now. So Ngāti Hangaro have a very bespoke response to what those landowners are seeking, and so we will look to do that through the city plan review.
Good point. I'm happy with it. I did just note on a separate issue. Oh well, just carrying on from that. So you know how we've got 4, 5, and 6 up there, and so those numbers that are identified there, those numbers relate to reaching the 15 per night. And so what you're saying with the opportunity of working directly with those owners is that those numbers probably won't be achieved if they've got an aspiration to carry on with horticulture or some other needs as well. Okay.
Okay, I'm going to suggest that, and I'll move, that we leave this on the table right now, because we do need to entertain the next item because our external presenter is here and has limited time. It will allow us, I think, with that break, to look at, and possibly there may be some who want to, look at that B3 wording to BLU, may be part of that conversation, and others that just give a bit more clarity around how that's going to go forward. And so when we do come back to move a resolution, we could incorporate a slightly amended one there. But I'll move that we just leave this on the table now. If I have a seconder, please. Thank you, Mayor Temby. And then we'll take a break. We need a break, and we'll be coming back at 11:45 for item 2, the multimodal shift plan. I'll put that, therefore, all those in favour please say aye. Against? Carried. Okay, we'll adjourn now until 11:45, please. Thank you. Sure.
Yep. Yes, to pure. Yep. To pure. Yep. Yep. Okay. Good. Yep. Yeah.
Improve it a little bit. Like commence is not the right word. We should be continuing, because we have been doing it. But just, it almost suggests that everything's going to wait until 2024 when we do the town and city plan review. Well, there's things perhaps we could do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So we may want to try and just talk with Andy, and I mean, maybe Jez as well, but without giving more certainty than we can, but expand the wording. I'll ask Andy to talk, and we could do that at lunchtime because we won't come back to this till Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. We will have a change of agenda or change of order to go to 8.2 now, the Bay of Plenty mode shift plan, after having left the other one lying on the table. So we have presentations here. Thank you, Mr. Cole O'Keefe and Alistair Talbot and Peter Saiziyama. Who's leading here? Alistair? Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Good morning, committee. Just with me to my right is Cole O'Keefe. He's the lead strategic planner for the Transport Agency and one of our key contacts as we work with the agency. And Peter, you'll know, is one of our senior transport planners. Purpose of this paper is to provide just a brief overview of the mode shift plan and seek your endorsement to that plan. The mode shift plan is a national initiative, and the agency, Waka Kotahi, have been leading the development of mode shift plans for high growth areas, Tauranga being one, over the last 9 to 12 months on behalf of the Minister of Transport. We have developed a mode shift plan working in partnership with the Regional Council, the agency and Western Bay. It focuses on the whole of the Bay of Plenty region, but at this stage, given the more pressing issues around mode shift in the Western Bay, the real content of the mode shift plan focuses on the Western Bay sub-region at this time. A subsequent step, which will be left to the territorial authorities in the other parts of the region, is to develop more specific mode shift actions and objectives for those parts of the east and central Bay of Plenty. The mode shift plan itself is largely a collation of existing plans, strategies and policies that you'll be familiar with. I guess most notably the recent Urban Form and Transport Initiative, or UFTI. Will also, when those activities are identified through the Western Bay Transport System Plan, reflect those mode shift activities from that planning process. And the list of actions identified in the tables from paragraph, I think it's 24 onwards in the agenda. In terms of next steps post endorsement of the mode shift plan, we continue to go about implementing the actions in the table in the paper, and those activities are also prioritised through, well, likely to be prioritised through the next National Land Transport Program. Cole may want to touch on that a little bit further and also provide just an overview of the mode shift plan from Waka Kotahi's perspective.
Morning all. I think Alice has probably covered it pretty well, but the current GPS had Minister's expectations for Waka Kotahi to work with partners to develop mode shift plans for the high growth areas. We developed the Keeping Cities Moving national strategy last year, and just to really provide a brief summary of that sort of focus on, in terms of mode shift, achieving the outcomes for enhancing access, providing greater economic prosperity, reducing environmental impact, providing a safer transport system, and improving public health. It really focuses on 3 pillars, and you'll see that in the paper. The responses have sort of been divided within those 3 pillars of mode shift, and that's shaping urban form, making shared and active modes more attractive, and influencing travel demand and transport choices. As Alistair mentioned, it was really good timing in terms of developing the mode shift plan, because we had UFTI, the Te Papa Spatial Framework, and currently the Tauranga System, or Transport System Plan, developing, which all have sort of key objectives of achieving mode shift, and we've tried to tactically and strategically capture all those mode shift initiatives and actions for the partners within these plans. I think we've sort of recognised that it would be a live document that we would update over time. And I think looking at the draft GPS for the next NLTP, it has got some quite strong expectations from the Minister in terms of implementing the mode shift plan. So as we get into prioritising activities for investment in the next National Land Transport Plan. Initiatives that are in a mode shift plan are likely to have a stronger strategic alignment with the GPS.
Great, thank you. So questions of the report, Councillor Clout, then Councillor Hughes.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I noticed that Rotorua Lakes and Eastern BOP have not submitted their sections yet, sub-regional sections. Is that an issue for us? Does it slow us down, or is there any impact? Can you explain, please?
Yeah, so I think other regions have a regional scope as well, but I think with this, the focus was on high growth centres. And the Minister had expectations to have the mode shift plan for those high growth centres completed by August, end of August. So our scoping exercise agreed that we should break the region up into those three subsections and prioritise the Western Bay sub-region section first, given that we had the Te Papa work that had come through in a timely manner, and that was the priority focus to be completed by August. So I think that subsection's now complete, and yeah, I don't see the Rotorua or Eastern Bay section slowing that down.
Thank you. So we just submit that earlier than the other two sub-regions. Okay,
That's right, yeah. So we're currently collating all the mode shift plans across New Zealand and packaging up for the Minister. We're looking within the next fortnight to send that through.
Councillor Hughes next, then Councillor Hollis, and Mayor Temby.
Just have a couple of questions around. One is looking at this community by community, and for example, we just looked at Welcome Bay and the challenges there are pretty much constrained by the street. So what are the opportunities for working with our engagement team and with transport team and with a community to sort of see, okay, so what would it look like if we had an aspiration for 20% of people changing modes, and how would they like to do that? I mean, because I think at the moment we sort of seem to look in buses and bikes, but there's things like communities might be looking at rideshare with each other, things like, you know, all sorts of other options that communities might come up with as a in their own way. Are we looking at that kind of way of doing things?
So I guess inherent in our project development is a level of engagement and community consultation, and I guess through those activities identified through the Transport System Plan project, for example, you know, if we're going to focus on Welcome Bay Road, Turret Road and 15th Ave, then we'd want to engage with that community to understand, you know, their travel needs and demands, and therefore the solutions that can help respond to those. So I think that is built into our projects. It's just to differing levels depending on the community and the focus of the particular project.
Thanks. I have another one.
Is that all?
I do have another one, actually.
Yeah, go ahead.
On-demand transport. I was actually trying to get a presentation today about it. We've just had a presentation in our PT committee about on-demand, and one of the things they mentioned was that, you know, the vans take between 8 and 15 people, and someone said, well, what are the, you know, we want more capacity than that, but apparently our buses currently take an average of 7 people per bus. So in that sort of next 10-year phase, are we really looking at alternatives like this?
Yes, and through the option testing in the Transport System Plan project, we will be looking at mobility as a service type options for parts of the city that perhaps suit it better than others. So we are looking at it. Yeah.
Councillor Hollis and Mayor Temby.
The two greatest frustrations shown to us by our community are travel times, like congestion, and parking. This mode shift plan I don't think it looks at addressing anything to do with private vehicle use at all. It's going to be against private vehicles, and it seems anti-car, in fact. Is this plan going to do anything to improve parking and the travel by people with personal vehicles?
I guess I sort of probably take it back to the statements made in the government policy statement by the Ministry of Transport, which talk about the benefits of enabling people to move by other modes. And in doing that, you create capacity on the network, and that's for all users of the network, including those that want to use their vehicle. And in turn, I guess if you also achieve a level of mode shift, people into other ways of travel, then you are potentially decrease the demand for car parking and thereby create more opportunity for others to use
I understand the principles behind mode shift. I think that's really straightforward. If we build it, they will come, and yet we've got a bus service that, as Heidi has said, has an average of 7 people per bus, and that, I suspect, includes school time with the free buses. It's not being used. The bus system is inefficient and doesn't work. Otherwise, more people would use it. And every time I've looked at the times it takes to get across the city, it's about 3 to 4 times slower than going by car. And until we resolve that issue, nobody's going to use PT.
Was there a further question there? No.
It wasn't really. It was just just letting you know that we know why mode shift is happening, but the city doesn't want it. The city wants to be able to use their cars.
Christine Jones, like to make a comment?
So I think this is looking at non-private vehicle modes as a document. The TSP will look at all modes of transport and looking at how you accommodate each of those within the current corridors or change corridors, which ones would take priority. It will look at how long it will take people for journey times using different modes. So the questions that you're asking, they're all going to come through for a conversation through the TSP, but saying that the TSP will still be strongly linked to the government policy statement, which is giving clear direction because that's how the money flows. But that's where the opportunity for the discussion, debate, and the elected members to choose prioritisation and allocation of funding to achieve certain objectives. So I think that is, you've had a couple of workshops and there is a meeting in September for approval of that by council or endorsement to flow into the regional land transport program.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, Tembi?
Thank you, Chair. Look, mine's a question around practicality, really, and addressing things practically. I mean, aspirationally, this is great, and look, we should be cycling central. We're temperate, we're flat, we're small as a city size, so we should be able to do these things. We do, to Andrew's point, have buses which are big and yellow and empty, and at the PT meeting, the regional PT meeting last week, I think it was, Heidi, was it last week? That we addressed that openly, saying that we've got to get one team under one roof, which is to say regional and Tauranga City Council, because we're failing our community in every regard. The buses are a failure. But my question is really about the practicalities of the delivery of this, and Christine's addressed it in part, I guess. But, for example, we can't, it would seem, for reasons that elude me, produce more than 20 or 30 bus shelters a year, and yet we shy 300 or 400 of them. And I guess what I'm asking here is, when are we going to take this wonderful aspirational vision, which I think is a good thing, by the way, I'm not knocking it, but turn it into practical steps of delivery rather than talking about it in a big hand, small map way? Because there are some very practical things that need to happen for its delivery.
Chief Executive?
Well, perhaps if I can pick up on the point about the bus stops. The reason why we're not putting bus stops in at the moment is because we don't actually know, and there is no mechanism at this point until they bring in the card, how many people are actually travelling on our buses from where and to where. And so we're a wee bit cautious about going there and putting bus stops in places where they're not necessarily wanted or needed until we can actually scientifically, if you like, or with evidence, prove exactly where they're needed. So that's the backdrop to the bus stop issue. But
carrying on from that, there's further work and discussions about the actual routes of the bus network, and that's happening through TSP and other conversations. So until they are clearer, the question is about appropriate investment and are we putting the bus stops in the right place, but more importantly, bus facilities, the larger bus facilities, where do they need to be located and when is that capacity needed? So again, that's a further piece of work that Regional Council are commissioning at the moment and will dovetail into the TSP.
Perhaps the resolution that's been passed previously to get governance and the organisations working together on public transport is so needed, because I imagine we're having a conversation here about one aspect of it and the Regional Council is having a similar conversation about a different aspect, and the sooner that we can, I guess, have those meetings and come together on this, the better.
Okay. Any other questions? Otherwise I'll entertain a mover for the motion. Councillor Robson.
It's really, this is quite high level stuff. It's very principled, whatever. And I've read the report. Is there anything in here that substantively changes the motions, the principles, the policies, the strategies that we've signed up for as a council, and by committing to the WBTSP, by signing up for UFTI, by signing the MOU? Is there anything in here that actually challenges anything we've already signed up for? Because I didn't see anything. It almost seemed like just a gathering of things we've signed up for and documenting them in a different way. You know, is that a fair or unfair?
No, that's a fair representation. It's a collation of existing plans, strategies and policies that relate to
I'm
mode
happy
shift.
to vote for it if someone moves in seconds.
Okay, we have a mover and the mayor. I will second it. Speaking to it.
Just very quickly, because I think we've covered it all, but this is aspirational, and I think we, you know, well, I'm very sure that we do need to move, you know, our thoughts progressively into multimodal shifts of various sorts. We can't continue to throw cars onto the roads. It's just not going to work. And part of it is, as I said before, we are a city of small geographical size. I know we've got topographical challenges, but geographically we're very small. So this should really work for us. You know, having bus routes that we can define really clearly, having bus shelters at the bus stops that need them. This is not rocket science, I'm sure. And being able to create safe, grade-separated cycleways and walkways, both for young cyclists, or cyclists generally, and our elderly people. And we have a growing older population, and we do need to account for that as well. And when I think of cycleways, in my mind, I've firmly got a picture of mobility scooters, not just cycles. And in the future, hopefully soon, lime scooters or an electric scooter of some sort. But we need to find a way of getting on with this and link these cycleways up and make sure it's safe, because the roads are not safe, you know. And as a cyclist, possibly an ex-cyclist after some of the experiences I've had, it's just not safe, and we've got to find a way of cracking these really hard nuts, building bus shelters outside, you know, properties that may object to them. I think we've got to find a way of negotiating our way through that and getting through cycleways on land where there's some resistance. I think we've got to find a way of negotiating positively through all these challenges. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Hollis next, then Councillor Hughes. Are you indicating?
It might well be aspirational, but the bulk of the city does own cars, wants to own cars and wants to drive them. There is far fewer people cycling than people driving. There's even examples of families with a pile of kids and their friends with restricted licences who can't travel together, who will refuse to take the bus because to get to where they want to go it will cost them 3 buses and an hour and a half worth of mucking around to do a 20-minute journey, and they all take all of their cars to the location that they're going to. If that's what they want to do and that's their ability and that's the mode that they're choosing, we need to make sure that we don't impact and impede that while we are growing these other modes. Doing it as a band-aid off cold turkey approach will not work, and it will get pushback from people in the community.
Councillor Hughes, then Councillor Robson.
Yes, there's a lot of work going on right now, and there's a lot of different streams, and I'm really looking forward to having that coordination between, especially for PT, of our 2 councils working together better, 3 councils working together better, and along the comments around everybody in this city likes to drive, actually, I think that engagement at a local level is just so important, because we might just find that everybody doesn't want to drive. They want to be able to have good options. And even though the bus system currently isn't functioning, what we're after is the kind of outcomes that mean that people have the kind of transport that they want to be able to choose, and that's transport choice. So on with the show. Lots of work ahead. Thank you.
Councillor Robson.
It's a topic that arouses similar levels of passion to the one of Māori wards, Māori representation. I think the challenge I face with this, look, I'm happy to support the motion because it's putting together the documentation necessary for us to consider things and see things in a different way and a more unified perspective. But what I'm hearing in the statements made by some of my colleagues is very strong ideological positions. And I'm somewhat enjoy what the Netherlands have done. And if you go and look at a city like Utrecht, for instance, what you see there is amazing cycleways. It's absolutely stunning. And cycleway advocates will point you to pictures of their cycleways and say that's what we want. What they won't point you to is the 4-lane motorways, the fact that Utrecht is one of the hubs of the Netherlands motorway network. The city is ringed by 4-lane grade-separated motorways. The roading system there is stunning, and it enables you to drive at 130 kilometres an hour without roundabouts or intersections or city state highway 29s or anything else to wherever it is you want to go very successfully. Enormously high levels of car ownership, significant mileage driven. Multimodal means exactly that. It means multimodal. Yet whenever we talk multimodal, immediately it becomes a conversation about modal shift. It's like we're not prepared to do what the heading said. We'd fail if this was an exam test because we'd be talking to a question that the examiner hadn't asked. And the biggest issue we face as a country is our reluctance to properly fund the infrastructure we want. And until we address that, we'll forever be fighting over insufficient funding. It'll become an adversarial debate because there's not enough to do the job properly. I urge people to go and look at a map of Utrecht and understand how it's done, and then go look at what the Dutch, the Netherlands do with regard to taxing their population and funding things. There are lessons we can learn, but I fear we're not going to learn them in this chamber.
Councillor Arbery.
Couldn't help myself. Yes, I was on the bus yesterday, forgot my mask, so I had to fashion a mask out of a hoodie, which was really uncomfortable. I think, speaking to the report, obviously we're just endorsing something that's being led by Waka Kotahi and the Regional Council, and it looked good to me, so I'm happy to endorse that. But with the buses, I think we just need to keep in mind that the buses are an essential service for those who can't drive. So on the bus, the people I see are basically elderly who I assume don't have their licence anymore, or kids that are reasonably young and probably don't have their licence. So the reason the buses are so empty is because they actually provide a reasonable service on the routes that I take, because you're offering them every 15 minutes. So you've got these frequent buses, but the flip side to that is they're not as full. So it's just something to bear in mind. It's not a service for everyone, but for some people, that's the only way they can get around. So, I mean, we can't talk too long about it because that's Regional Council's jurisdiction anyway, but just some counterpoints.
Other speakers? Well, I add my short 2 cents worth, but I think sometimes we get ourselves caught with this mode shift plan, where really we ought to be talking about a mode provision plan, because the shift sends the implication that we're all going to get dragged out of our cars onto other things if we don't want to. There are people who want to travel other ways, and we should be providing for that. And in this city, we had a report to council recently, I was just trying to find it before, but showed our growth from 2006, I believe, through to 19 or 17, I think it was, which was over 3% a year. So we must provide other modes of transport, or we're going to be buried in congestion. Just our growth alone, our shifting of people out of cars onto bikes if they wish, or onto buses if that serves them better, is not going to solve congestion with the kind of growth that we have. It's phenomenal. And so even in the UFTI presentations, we realised some of the issues there were that we weren't even thinking about what it's going to be like with the growth we have in the city. So we must do these things. We must provide alternative methods of transportation. I probably will, to my dying day, still drive in my semi-electric car without CO2 emissions to where I want to go, because it's the way I prefer to go. But there are people who want to travel other ways. It's more convenient for them, it's more acceptable for them, and we need to provide for those. And I think that's the nub of the GPS statement, is we can't be car-centric forever. There are commercial people who travel by car who will always do so. They're not going to be able to get on a bus. So the plan is important, and I fully support it. It's pulling together existing things, but it will go into the TSP and become something much more aspirational as we go forward. Some of us in the last term went to Christchurch, and here I am talking on longer than I said I was going to, but some of us went to Christchurch and saw their cycle network there and how much time it took to implement it, but how great it is and how many people cycle down there because they feel safe in off-road cycleways, and that's what we need to see developed here. Thank you. Mayor Temby, your right of reply. Thank you. So I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Abstentions? That's against, is it? Abstain. So that is carried. 10 and 1 abstention. If we might return now to the matter laying on the table, we'll just go straight to the resolutions. Yes, Councillor Salisbury, you look... Oh, sorry, 11, it's 11 and 1. Thank you for picking that up. 11 and 1. Just as well there wasn't a split vote and the chair had a casting vote. We'll go back to our first item, and we have just a couple of amendments. I know you have indicated, Councillor Robson, that you wish to move. I wonder if we can just show you those, a little bit of word tweaking there that the staff have worked on with Tapio's assistance, and then I'll give you that opportunity to move it if you like. Just maybe helps not have an amendment through the process. So we're just clarifying a little bit more in 3 and 4 that we're continuing engagement and other avenues and the further workshops with elected members, so we can also get further informed about the good work that's going on in other areas. You okay with that, Councillor Robson? Okay. And then 4 is an additional with some of the other resources that are there. So that being the case, if Councillor Robson moves and Mayor Temby seconds, speaking to it, Councillor Robson.
Yeah, look, I'd like to thank staff, because I think this was a sort of a bit of a, it was introduced as a high-level study, but it's a textbook exercise for us, and I think there was a significant amount of EM education in the process. And I thank you for your patience, that I think what it revealed in the questions that EM's answered is we need to up our game and our understanding of development. Perhaps we need development, I won't be harsh, maybe not 101, but 201 for elected members. We definitely need Māori land 101 and 201, and we see it here. There is a real issue with the way we fail to engage, and it's an ongoing issue in our community. The recent UFTI report stated in itself that we didn't engage with tangata whenua properly. The peer reviewer, it's one of the things they agreed with wholeheartedly when they reviewed it, that we didn't engage, and we've really got to change that, because without genuine engagement, you know, the only solace I can offer tangata whenua at the moment is basically we're not very good at engaging most parts of our community, and despite the exhortations of the treaty, we fail tangata whenua just the same as we fail everyone else. But we do need to do some work in that place. I was given hope in terms of how we're moving forward in this by the obiter dicta from staff, where the concept of different zones was created, and I think that's something important for us to carry into our thinking about the new city plan. I do think sometimes we're a bit unsophisticated or unnuanced in the way we see our city, the complexities of it, and I think zoning in different ways and recognising aspirations within different zones is really, really important. Look, I think this is a good study. I think there's more work to do in this area. I think what it reveals is elected members have work to do in this area. I think what it reveals is the organisation has work to do in this area still around engaging. But yeah, this is a nice piece of work. It prompts further thought. It moves things forward. There are questions arising from it, which I assume are being picked up by staff and will be addressed in the next level, so I don't want to get into detail. But yeah, thank you. Appreciate the efforts and look forward to the next episode.
Yeah, Timby.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'd like to just thank staff as well on all the work they have done on the forgotten suburb. I think from my perspective, what Tipoi led us through in our thinking today encompasses the real opportunity for greater cooperation and collaboration with iwi. And I think if we continue to do this across Tauranga Moana, not only for land and roads and the obvious infrastructural opportunities, but for a range of other opportunities, I think we will find that we will have a progressive and more enhanced city in no time. So I just wanted to thank Tipoi for his thoughts and for sharing them so openly. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Arbery.
Can we just scroll up to number 1 of those resolutions? Yeah. So number 1 there, it says do not proceed structure planning or additional urban development, and then the reason is because of transport constraints and costs. The rest of the resolutions I'm really comfortable with, but reading through the Oricon report, it does seem like we haven't considered our options properly yet. So if I just draw your attention to the map in front of us on page 1, on that report, the costing we've used is linking all the way up from Poikia Road right up to Victory Street. But if you look at the report, you know, the most expensive element is a big bridge over the wetlands between Victory Street and Kaitamako. So I'd be quite interested to know what the cost would be if we only link up from Kaitamako through to Ohawiti, rather than linking or putting in that big bridge over the wetlands. So my preference would be, I'm happy to support everything, but you know, personally I think we need to do more work, do a peer review on item 1, and just note that when NZTA did their investigations on the Haidini link, that was one of their options. And I can't remember exactly what their road layout was, but they came up with a cost of $25 million. So I think there is more work to do on the costing side. Yeah, so I think I'll leave that with staff, because staff can always choose to progress this if they think it would have value. That resolution can always be overturned if necessary. So I'm comfortable as it is, but yeah, I don't think we've considered our options properly here.
Thank you. We'll let that rest with your good comments there, I think, unless you wish to seek anything further from the staff in that regard. Other speakers to the motion? Sorry, Councillor Hughes.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to the staff. It's really helpful to look at things in terms of, well, what it would look like if we did this, this and this. It gives you a really good perspective of looking at our options. And And I really also appreciate the contribution of Te Poi and also of Des here in this conversation. And it makes me think of what that will be like once we have a ward councillor at our table in the future. It's going to be, it's always beneficial to see different perspectives. And I want to talk about the Ohauiti one, because from my perspective, we haven't yet seen examples of good neighbourhood development very often in this city. And even though we look at bigger areas, like the whole Ohauiti area, when are we going to look at our neighbourhoods in terms of one of our big problems in Tauranga is loneliness, and creating neighbourhoods for people to connect and respond and be able to have reasons to bump into each other is super important. So I just would like to see how we could look at working together with landowners to look at areas in terms of neighbourhoods, not in terms of whole areas as well, to come to some of our, to meet some of our objectives around the four well-beings in this city. Other than that, I'm happy to endorse the recommendations.
Thank you. Councillor Clout.
Yeah, thanks a lot. When I first got this report, I was a bit concerned that it had taken 3 years to get to this point, because I remember, 3 years ago when we initiated this project. But when you go through all those appendices, and I think there's about almost 400 pages worth, it makes some really interesting reading, and it covers the whole gambit from the three waters, the commercial centre, feasibility, education, open spaces, etc., and of course the transport network. And so, it's no surprise that it does take time to go through all of those in great depth. So thank you very much to staff for your input and your thoroughness on this, and I wholeheartedly endorse all of these recommendations. And I do support also Councillor Arbery's potential direction to look at sort of a hybrid model in terms of the transport link between west and east. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other members wish to speak to it? I'll pick up on Councillor Clout's comments about the 3 years ago. If we remember back then, we were needing to prove to our partners, particularly in the Western Bay, but also regional partners, that we weren't making good use of the land we already had before they gave us any more in the extension of our boundaries. And although it's taken 3 years, I think this is an excellent study that should answer those questions. There are limits to how much extra housing we can squeeze into our existing land areas, and whether wisely we do so as well. There are other constraints, so the transport issues are at the fore of the people who live in Welcome Bay, I think. But the study answers all those questions. There is room to do some more, and there is certainly room to do some with the Maori land and the Maori land trusts to try and unlock housing, but it's going to be a different model. It's going to be papakainga, it's going to be housing mixed with rural and whatever they wish to do on their land, but is not typical of the normal developer who comes along and buys up a big block of land and then puts 15 lots per hectare into it. But we are committed, I believe, as a council. We have been, as you so rightly said, to people that for years have been working on that project, going through Te Puni Kokiri and getting a plan for releasing housing, and we need to continue to do that. But it is slightly different than the normal models and more challenging in some ways, but it has to be done because everyone has the right to have a house and live on their own land, and we need to try and facilitate that as much as we can. So I think the resolution amendments are good, just to send a signal that this is not excluded. It's just at this point in this desktop study, it's been excluded from action at this point. But as soon as we can action things, we would like to do so. Bring us, unless there's other speakers, to the right of reply from the mover.
Yeah, thank you. There's been a couple of things opened up. I think, interesting enough, my mind's riffing on the previous topic, multimodal transport, and which provides different means of getting people from where they are to where they want to go. And I think the same thing applies, funnily enough, to development or the provision of housing for people. I think one of the situations in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is about 35 years ago, we shut down one of the modes for providing housing for people. The state pulled out, and frankly, it's never got back in there properly, and that's been an enormous problem. I think what we've also recognised, and maybe over that same 35 years, is that Māori, tangata whenua, offer another mode of providing housing for people. Some people, maybe just tangata whenua, maybe broader than that, who knows. So if we start thinking about the discussion of development as the multimodal approach to providing housing at whatever level people desire, community housing, I think we've got to look at, again, at all the modes, and we've got to also look at putting the money in. I'll make one other comment, because Councillor Hughes decided to open that door, and having not spoken much on this topic, I will take the opportunity to observe that the contribution we heard today didn't require someone having a seat at the council table. Just to respond to the point that was made, albeit slightly off topic, it deserves a response. The contribution we got today came from people at this table by invitation and by other members of the community who have provided the opportunity and encouraged to come and speak, and I thank them for their contribution.
Thank you.
I commend the motion to everyone.
Thank you. I will put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Any abstentions? That is carried. Thank you very much. You have now earned your lunch, which is waiting for you in the Councillors' Lounge. We will adjourn until 1 o'clock and continue on our final item of the day. Thank you very much.